Christmas music since Halloween. Raise your hand if you know somebody like that and point at them and say, shame. Of course, others are less excited. Maybe the right word for you is a little depressed about the Christmas season. Maybe it's that painful reminder that a loved one has gone on with the Lord. Others of you might be panicked about it. And that question of how on earth are you going to get it all done in time? But the question that I want to ask this morning is, can we get past all the distractions of this season, the shopping lists, the wrappings, the gifts, the lights, the decorations, the parties, the get-togethers, that eternal debate between which Starbucks cup truly embodies the spirit of Christmas? Can you get past all the stuff and discover the real heart of Christmas? Frederick Buechner once said that Christmas is kind of a vast joke where the creator of the universe comes to us in diapers. And then he goes on to say, until we have taken the idea of the God-man seriously enough to be scandalized by it, we have not taken it as seriously as it demands to be taken. You see, what separates Christianity from every other worldview or belief system or religion is this idea that God became human. One of us. Theologians call it the incarnation. And we're not talking about half God, half human. We're talking about the seemingly impossible paradox of 100% God and 100% human. St. Augustine puts it this way: man's maker was made man, that he, the ruler of the stars, might nurse at his mother's breast, that the bread of life might hunger, that the fountain would thirst, the light sleep, the way be tired on its journey, the truth might be accused of false witness, the teacher beaten with whips, the foundation suspended on wood, that strength might grow weak, that the healer might be wounded, that life might die. It is a scandalous idea if you really stop and think about it. And God did not appear to be human as the heresy Docetism taught. Jesus didn't take a weekend holiday from heaven to earth. He didn't pass through humanity with the divine ease of godly power. He became fully 100% human. As Paul says in our text, he emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave, being born in human likeness and being found in human form. He humbled himself. And it's amazing when you think about the kind of human that Jesus became. Now, if I were in his shoes, and I'm not, and I never will be, but I think if I got to decide, I would want to become a rich and powerful king, or an Olympic athlete, or a famous rock star with a full head of hair. But not Jesus. Jesus decided to become a poor Jewish carpenter's son. And remember, at this point in history, the Jewish people were a defeated and broken people who had been conquered again and again. They were a lowly people. But that's precisely the point of why God became Jewish, to able to identify with the least of these, the poor, the downcast, the marginalized, refugees, beggars, and outcasts. God didn't just become human. He didn't become a royal, rich king. He became a lowly human. That's what the story of the Nativity is all about, is it not? A poor Jewish baby born in a manger, soon to become a refugee on the run because King Herod wanted him killed. At Christmas, we celebrate the fact that the God of the universe embraced the fullness of the human condition. That's what we're talking about this morning. The human condition. Anthropologists, psychologists, and philosophers categorize the human condition as those things unique to the human experience. Experiences like birth, learning, emotion, pain, reason, conflict, struggle, and even death. Commenting on the human condition, the persistent pessimist Woody Allen once said, "Life is full of misery, loneliness, and suffering, and it's all over much too soon." I think Woody Allen actually rightly identifies the three hardest parts about being human, the three most tragic symptoms behind the human condition: loneliness, suffering, and death. So this morning, I want us to pause. And I want you to think about those three hard symptoms to the human condition: loneliness, suffering, and death. And I want you to consider the incarnation, how Jesus took on the human condition and what he does with those three symptoms. First, loneliness. By definition, loneliness is an emotional response to perceived isolation. A recent study found that 1 in 3 Americans feel lonely on a regular basis. Or as the other psychologists, the Beatles, would sing, "I look at all the lonely people." Yeah. That was for Dan Peterson, and a little bit for John Mason. As a pastor, I can tell you, though, that loneliness is the number one pastoral issue I respond to. And when it comes to the expressions of addiction like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, pornography, or when it comes to our obsession with social media or the hookup culture, all of it comes from loneliness, a desire to either reach out or numb out. In the Bible, in the creation account, when you look at the book of Genesis, the first time that God says something was not good is when he saw that man was alone. Henry Nouwen said, practically every human being has experienced that strange inner gnawing, that mental hunger, that unsettling unrest that makes us say, "I feel lonely." And then he says loneliness is the most universal human experience. But Jesus understands your loneliness. Isaiah 53 says that he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, despised and rejected. At the hardest moment in his life, when he's under attack by the religious authorities, when he is facing certain death, Jesus was abandoned by his closest friends. His greatest disciple denied that he even knew him on 3 occasions. Jesus understands your loneliness. And he felt it most profoundly when he was nailed out on the cross and cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's because in that moment, the sin of the world, your sin and my sin, was laid upon his shoulders as he took on the punishment we deserve, died the death we should have died. He felt that painful separation from God the Father, that dark loneliness. Jesus plunged himself in an unimaginable loneliness so that you might be able to go through not just life, but eternity, never feeling that divine isolation. You might experience solitude, you might be alone, but you don't ever have to taste the bitterness of loneliness again. when you discover the enduring presence of Christ that dwells inside your heart. When you discover that you're never alone. Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 28, I am with you always to the very end of the age. And that's the underlining message of Christmas. Emmanuel. It means God with us. If you're feeling lonely during this Christmas season or at any point in your life, I encourage you to turn inward to the Christ that dwells inside your heart as you discover that you are never as alone as you think you are. And what of suffering? If you have been diagnosed with what we call the human condition, which we all have been, then you are going to suffer in your life. It's a fact of life. But Christmas, because of Christmas, and I know this sounds cliche, I really do, but it's true. Because of Christmas, you know that your suffering is never pointless or arbitrary, and you know that your suffering is not the end of the story. A couple of years ago, I saw an old friend post something on Facebook about her struggles with a long-term illness. And she wrote this. She said, there is no point to this illness. No lesson to be learned, no silver lining, no good from bad, no evidence that God is mysteriously working behind the scenes. There's no point to it. I'll admit that reading that made me feel profoundly sad. Because that post, it feels so incredibly meaningless and void of hope. But I think that in our world today, that's how most people experience real suffering. There's no point to it. And I think that thinking that way or posting something like that might be raw and honest, and I think there's something even good to that honesty, but it doesn't make it true. Suffering may feel meaningless at the time. In fact, you know what? Suffering's going to feel meaningless at the time. But just because you can't see a meaning behind it doesn't mean that there's no meaning. It's going to be impossible to see in the moment. But God promises us. I'm not saying this. God promises us. God promises us. God promises us that He will work out for the good all things for those who love Him. It's kind of like Harry Potter. I'm just going to warn you, you're not going to get through Christmas at Mountain View without hearing a little bit about Harry Potter and Narnia and Lord of the Rings. It's going to happen. Who am I kidding? You're going to hear it all throughout the year. But if you read the Harry Potter books, you know that Harry is being mentored by Albus Dumbledore, the old, wise, powerful headmaster of Hogwarts. But as you read the books, that you're going to notice that Dumbledore allows Harry to endure danger, suffering, hardship, and incredible challenges. In fact, much of the time, if you're reading these books, you're going to say, someone needs to call CPS on Dumbledore because he keeps putting this kid in danger. But at one point in the last book, Harry is arguing with his friends Hermione and Ron. And they're talking about this frustration that they have around the mystery and the seemingly meaningless suffering behind what Dumbledore has allowed to happen to them. And there's this moment where Harry kind of clicks it all together and he realizes it and he says this, Dumbledore let me figure out stuff for myself. He let me try my strength and test it, and he let me take risks. And you hear Harry start to realize that over time, Dumbledore wasn't just mentoring him or randomly allowing him to suffer, but Dumbledore was preparing Harry, forging him, molding him, equipping him for this great and terrible battle that's going to take place between Harry and Lord Voldemort. Could it not be that our suffering is the same kind of forging? That God is shaping you, molding you, and transforming you into something great that you can't see. And it doesn't make sense in the moment. Do you have the kind of faith that God is good and He knows what He's doing? Romans 5 says that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us. And the doctrine of Christian hope is the belief that in the end, good will win. Evil will lose. And your suffering is never meaningless or random. Your life is not pointless. And if you don't know any of this, it's because you're asleep to the fact that there's this grand battle going on around you at all times. But God is looking, preparing, searching for people with character. So He can send them out into the world to bring hope. Remember what Jesus tells His disciples? You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts a basket over it. No, he puts it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Your suffering is never pointless. I refuse to believe that. I refuse to accept that, and the church ought to as well. And the truth is, you are never alone in it. Christ has suffered for you and suffers with you, and He understands. In Christ, you have a brother. And what of the last symptom of this human condition that we all have? What of death and the shadow that it casts over our lives? Well, friends, that's why Christmas is so joyful. In it is that promise that the last enemy to be destroyed is death itself. Eugene Peterson used to talk about what he viewed his main responsibility and role was to be a pastor. And he used to say that my role as a pastor is to help prepare people for their own death. I love Eugene Peterson, but I don't know if that's enough. What if the role of the pastor isn't to prepare people for death? What if it's to prepare people for eternity? What if death is not the end? Why else are we here? Why do we do all of this? My question for you this morning is, how would you live your life now if you knew you were never going to die? When Lazarus died, Jesus' good friend, Jesus came to his grave and Jesus said, "Those who believe in me, even though they die, they will live. And everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die." When it comes to the church, we need to stop talking about death as the end, and we need to start talking about living for eternity. 2 Timothy 1 says that Jesus abolished death. He destroyed it, and He brought life and immortality. The philosopher, theologian Dallas Willard once said, "You are never going to cease existing. You are never going to cease existing, so what are you going to do about it?" The problem isn't death, it's life. And he says, eternity is not later, it's now. Learn how to live in eternity now. This is why your life matters. But be warned. Take this warning seriously. Revelation 22 talks about eternity, and it says this: let those who do evil still. Let those who are filthy be filthy still. And let those who are righteous be righteous still. What that text means is that the path that you are on now carries through into eternity. That means how you live today, what you love, what you worship, who you are on the inside matters eternally. That's why all of this comes together. It's such a profound point. Understanding that God is doing something in your life with eternal consequences. Having faith matters. You are never going to cease to exist, and the problem isn't death, it's life. And what are you going to do with it? What will you do about your human condition? At Christmas, we celebrate the reality that God became human. He took on the human condition. Why? To slowly undo the stranglehold that death and sin had on each and every one of us. Or, as you prefer, Samwise Gamgee once put it, so that everything sad would come untrue.